you have a capacity of loving. You can love others, you can love self, and you can love God. And it's all one love. It's all one movement of the soul. So do you need to love yourself in order to have a relationship with God? Yes, absolutely, you do. But not in the way that demands that you do so from a place of existential anxiety or shame or guilt or such. More like the target you're aiming for. Increase your capacity of love by increasing your awareness of God. That's the point here. Well, hey everybody, welcome back to the Liminal Living Podcast. I am Dr. Tom, and we made it today. This is official. We made it to episode lucky number 13, and I am kind of proud of that fact. So I just wanted to throw that out there, that I have thrown one of these out there every week now for 13 weeks straight, and y'all have been listening. And I just appreciate it so very much. I've learned a lot with the different guests and the different questions that I've had thrown this way, and it's just really cool. Next week I got another guest that'll be on the podcast. This week we have the Ask Me Anything Part 2. I asked for questions, like, do you have any spiritual questions? Submit some questions, spiritual, theological, all that kind of stuff. I ended up getting 4 pages worth of questions that I was just kind of like blown away by how many questions people have. And these are like really, really good, deep questions. And so I wanted to really take some time to answer some of these questions, and not necessarily like from like the Bible answer man perspective kind of a thing, but more of just like if I was to walk you through direction and you had this question, I would try and give you perspective or practice that would help you through the process of usually, like when you're having struggles with your faith, there's a lot of times it's over ideas that you can't reconcile with what you see. And so having broader perspective can help with that. So today we are doing spiritual practice as the Q&A mode. Last week was kind of around suffering and silence and God going quiet and dark nights and all that. I kind of grouped a whole bunch of questions around that. This one today is about spiritual practice, and all that kind of. I got like 6 pages of notes and questions for y'all because y'all are amazing. Next time we do the Ask Me Anything, I've kind of grouped a bunch of theological questions together that were really good, and then the time after that we have like church, society. Questions that are wrong, and then there's a whole thing of miscellaneous questions. So there's a whole lot of questions here as I'm scrolling through on my laptop right now. So today is Ask Me Anything Part 2, the Spiritual Practice Edition. So hold on to your hats. We are gonna jump in. All right, so our first question comes from my friend Joseph, who actually, his first name is my middle name. I am actually Tom Joseph, but his middle name is not Tom, so it's not reciprocal like that. But his question, he wrote in, do I need to love myself to have a relationship with God? Or to love God? Do I have to love myself? Now, that's a loaded question. I can just give the short answer of yes, or I can go into more explanation on why. So before I actually dive into the question, we kind of have to define the theological system that this question is contained within, so that we can take a few steps back for that perspective that we need. So we have to ask the question, what does one mean by saying to have a relationship with God? Now, it usually sums up like a recent theological system of salvation held by modern evangelicals that was learned in the revivalist period in America and some movements in the UK. And I did some doctorate work and studies on some of these movements and stuff, but I am by no means a church historian or expert on this stuff, but I did dive into it in my doctoral studies a little bit. And kind of this theological understanding that has, been larger in American Western evangelical context, maintains that you must have some sort of individual conversion experience in order to switch the default setting on your eternal destination from eternal conscious torment, burning in hell, to heavenly bliss with God. That's kind of that's the mindset that this question is asking from within. Now, the soil of that movement grew. It was something called pietism, which began in Germany in the Lutheran Church, which I don't really think of Lutherans as being uber pious, like I would like a fundamentalist or a Baptist kind of pious, where you don't drink and you don't listen to secular music and you don't all the don'ts. Germans don't, Lutherans, I shouldn't say Germans. Lutherans don't embrace a lot of the don'ts of the fundamentalisms. But within Lutheran Church, something called pietism grew out of that, and they started to emphasize personal transformation through spiritual rebirth and renewal. And that happened through individual devotion in piety. And by piety, I mean like personal righteousness or holy deeds, things that you're going to do, right? That sounds like every church in America, right? Like that we all grew up in. Now, from that was a long time ago, out of the Lutheran Church in Germany. Now, from there, a man named John Wesley, which we might be a little more understanding of who that name was, he had a famous moment where his heart was strangely warmed. That was a direct quote from John Wesley, recounting an experience that he had with God where his heart was strangely warmed. And that sparked what is known as the First Great Awakening of the 1700s with the rise of the Methodist Church. John Wesley founded the Methodist Church way back in the day. Now, revivalists, during these times of American history, they went around encouraging people to have knowledge of Christian doctrine and like a personal conversion story that then maintained the standing with God through evidence, like prove it to me kind of stuff. You say you got a relationship with God, then you better be at church on Sunday every single week. You better have this personal morality that is specifically designed in the context that I grew up in. And there was a lot of like religious devotion. You had to be really excited and zealous about your faith all the time to prove that you had this personal conversion moment. Your heart was strangely warm too. Right, and then came arguably the most famous sermon in American history. Unfortunately, it was called Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God by Jonathan Edwards, who was the, quote, fire and brimstone preacher mentioned by Aaron Burr in the Hamilton musical piece, Wait For It, when he says, my grandfather was a fire and a brimstone preacher, but there are things that the hymns and the homilies don't teach you. Like that person, his grandfather was Jonathan Edwards, and he really was a fire and brimstone preacher. The sermon that he wrote called Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, it pretty much said that God's disposition towards humans is one of anger. And the only thing holding you back from the fires of hell is this, and he gave like this illustration of a single thread that holds you over the pit of a fiery hell, and that thread is like just the next breath that you take. And that's the very grace of God is keeping you from falling into this eternal conscious torment forever and ever. Not a very nice person, not a very nice God at all. So it was kind of, the message was, you better convert and you better stay converted and you better be really serious about this or you're in trouble. So you can see this, and this is in the 1700s. And the evangelical movement used fear as a tool to get and maintain adherence. And then they used really good marketing to attract folks to like these big tent meetings and soapbox pulpits. Get off your soapbox. That's because these evangelicals would stand on a soapbox on street corners and start preaching on the corner. Now, by the time of the Second Great Awakening in kind of the early to mid 1800s, there was this guy named Charles Finney, and he came around and he used this framework of marketing that effectively like shaped the modern church's practice of like how we do church, even to this day. And there's 7 things that make what he says a preacher more effective at getting conversions in the tent. Now, this sounds like a megachurch to me, and kind of acted like one. And these 7 things that preachers could do that were more effective at getting people converted, there's 7 things. He called them, he didn't call them, but they were called his new measures. And they came from this lecture that he delivered called Measures to Promote Revivals. And it was in 1835 in New York. And he mentions the term new measures 6 times and measures 12 times. So you can see why people just started calling these Finney's new measures. Now, basically, he's saying the Bible doesn't say how to get people. So we can use any measure necessary or any means necessary. On top of that, like, God seems to use new measures to grow his church at different points in history. So let's just be on the cutting edge of these new measures and invent them ourselves. Now, Finney was a Presbyterian, and they're kind of Calvinistic in their understanding. And he was not really accepted by his Presbyterian folks. He believed that a person was not all the way sinfully depraved in their humanity as the Calvinists believed in total depravity. So he got really heated on this in debates with the Presbyterians, put him at odds with them. He said that it's not their whole being that's depraved, it's their will. It's their ability to make good decisions. So we, the preachers, need to use certain psychological tactics that help depraved minds or wills make a decision for God. Now, if you have any red flags going up, you should, because this sounds a lot like emotional manipulation and pressured conversions, because that's what he's criticized for in his day, actually. You're just emotionally manipulating people. But it got the metrics. So he continued to do it. He's like, it must be right because more people are coming to my meetings than your meetings, so I'm good. Now, does this sound like anything modern day? Like, we look at the whole Mark Driscoll, Mars Hill debacle, and we're like, well, the guy was a big jerk, and he hurt a lot of people, and he's abusive, and all this stuff. But, he got the metrics. He grew the attendance. He got the buildings. He got the budget. He got all these things. So it works. It gets the metrics. So it must be okay. Now you're probably thinking, what are the 7 things that he said had to be used? Well, one is called protracted meetings. Now that meant having a longer revival that was a few days long to maybe a full week. So you'd roll into town, he'd pop up his tent, and he would say, there's revival meetings here every night this week. And what he said that did was it promoted a heightened spiritual experience that was more likely to stick. Now, think Christian summer camp, but for the whole town. You get away on a week, and then all of a sudden you're in an emotionally different state, and then you hear this message, then you want to do something about it, and you're changed because you're at a quote, heightened spiritual experience, right? You're promoting and prolonging that spiritual experience, so it's supposed to stick longer. So long meetings. You roll into town, throw up the tent, and have long meetings. The second thing he did was called the anxious bench, which is the dumbest name ever because who wants anxiety, right? But he practiced this thing called the anxious bench, where he would invite individuals who were experiencing religious conviction in the middle of the moment, in the middle of the tent, and they didn't have salvation yet, but they were having this religious conviction because they're in this tent and they're hearing this preaching from this very charismatic preacher, and it's causing them to have anxiety in themselves. So they had this, he called that inner anxiety was religious conviction. So if you're experiencing that, you come on down here and you sit on this anxious bench during this revival meeting, and everyone in this room is going to pray for your soul. Now, if you're an introvert and you're cringing, yeah, me too. But this allowed for immediate public responses to the preached message. So not only are you rolling into town and you have revivals and lots of people are there, but now you're seeing actual metrics of changed lives in front of you, quote, because there's all these people coming down to the anxious bench and there's all these public declarations of faith. And now that was the third thing, a public invitation to get to the meeting. So he really just did extended good marketing. And it's like, don't just you come, but you got to invite a friend to the tent meeting and you got to get down here. And so he would urge individuals to invite people, and then he would urge individuals to make a decision for Christ, quote, and come forward and profess your faith. So this is like the altar call. He invented the altar call, like for real. And he called it the anxious bench. But he get people in this heightened spiritual state, and then you get an anxious bench for them to sit on, and then there's a public invitation, like, do it, make the decision now. And then, arms go up with all eyes bowed and all, show me that hand. I see that hand. This is that kind of a moment. Finney is the one who thought that up, and it was very effective because you could see it in motion, right? And then instead of solely relying on private conversations with Minister, Finney encouraged lay people to engage in personal conversations with individuals who wanted to have spiritual conversations. And this he called this personal inquiry. And this is 1, 2, 3, 4. This is one of the fourth or fifth one of his new measures. And the approach involved lay people asking pointed questions to prompt self-reflective questions. So, this is pretty much like the gospel tract kind of a thing. So the whole evangelistic understanding of how we practice church and how we get people to church and why we're getting people in church, it's all revolving around Finney's new measures and how he did things. You can see that churches still do these things today, right? And he stressed the significance of cooperation and collaboration among churches and evangelists, so that when an evangelist came to town, they weren't the pastor of the town. They would just get everybody all stirred up and fervored and in church, and then he'd hand it over to the pastor and say, okay, I grew your church for you. I'm on to another place. See ya. And so he believed in organizing interdenominational revivals and encouraging clergy to work together and all this stuff. That one's actually a really good idea. But you can see that these new measures that Finney is using here, it really sums up how the evangelical church in America does church and why we're doing church. And that's kind of in a crumbling state as of post-pandemic and everything. But he only had, there's a big flaw in this. The big flaw is there was only one metric, conversions. That's it. He even said, quote, the best educated ministers are the ones who have the most conversions. Now, Finney was the cool kid in town. He was the famous, megachurch pastor that everyone wanted to be like. So to hear your hero say that says that that's the only thing that matters for churches and for pastors that's your worth as a pastor, is how many conversions can you get. Now, you might be sensing a really big flaw here. That is, you get people emotionally worked up using fear, hellfire, judgment, paired with public displays of decisions, which leads to shaming and disgrace when you don't stick with it. Now, the famous author, novelist Mark Twain, who wrote Tom Sawyer, he actually made fun of this in his novel Tom Sawyer, because there was this revivalist that came to town, and the infamous Huck Finn, he found religion at this revival, and he stopped doing all the bad things he was doing. But Tom was sick, and he didn't get to the revival, so he didn't find religion. So he was still up to all the things that normally they would. And he was so sad that Huck wouldn't come and do all the things that they used to do. But after I think it was a week or so, Tom came to visit Huck, and he had a stolen watermelon. And I think Mark Twain said something along the lines, he got over his religion. So this was kind of that's how it worked. You come to town, you get the people all worked into emotional fervor and anxious and everything, and then you leave. And then it's the pastor's job to try and keep everyone there. And it didn't work, right? Like when Finney would come back to a town where he had a revival, most of the people lost that emotional fervor of their faith. And that should reveal the flaw in the system, right? Like maybe it's not all about conversions. Maybe it's not about getting people in the room and anxious and responding with anxiety and fear and judgment and shame. And maybe it's not all about that, right? And so it reveals the flaw in your system. What do? Do you modify yourself? No. You come up with a new theology to maintain that emotional fervor based on fear. And he came up with the term backslider. And you probably heard that term if you grew up in church. It's like a threatening term. Then being a backslider is basically the opposite of being, quote, on fire for God. Now, this is a direct quote from Finney about backslider. He coined the term. He coined the theology. We still use it today, unfortunately. Here's a direct quote. A person who is truly converted and is a Christian, but has left his first love. His zeal has grown cold. The ardor of his feelings and the depth of his piety are abated. Such a person is a backslider in heart. He may keep up all the forms of religion, attend to worship, public and private, and read the Bible, and go through all these exercises regularly, but the spirit is gone. All the fine edge of pious feelings is blunted. Have you less ardor of feeling, less fixedness of purpose, less faithfulness in duty? If you have, then I mean you. God means you. He calls you backslider. Dang, that's I think I need a voiceover guy to say the rest of this stuff. So he continues on. That is your name, you elder in the church, or you minister. If there be any such here, you woman, no matter what is your standing in the church, if that is the description of your character, then you are a backslider, and so you stand entered on the book of God. Okay, so that's intense. So he basically said that you have to get excited about your faith and stay excited about your faith. You have to never question your faith. You have to never... He actually says this is another direct quote, those who do not enjoy secret prayer and those who do not enjoy the study of Scripture more than any other book, those who let worldly-minded thoughts enter one's mind in the morning, you are a backslider. Okay, so that is that whole 1 hour quiet time devotion in the morning. That theology came out of this. Because you're scared to death that God hates you because you're not as emotionally worked up as you once were at some other time in your life. Okay, so I got more Finney quotes here. If one does not feel painful anxiety and prayer in view of the state of the church, it is because they are backsliders. Dang, he just this is all from his writings on the backsliders. So he comes to town, gets everyone emotionally worked up, and then tells them, maintain this state of emotional fervor and zeal and excitement at all times. And then they don't. So then he comes back around and he's like, oh, you all are backsliders. You were once at this pinnacle experience of God. And like when you're converted, you're at a pinnacle experience. And then all of a sudden you backslide because you don't feel like you once did. Your emotions aren't backing up where you once were. And now you're a backslider. So now I got to make you very afraid of doing all those things. And he actually said this, another direct quote from Finney, and I'm going to apologize in advance. He said, backsliders are the most unhappy, guilty, despicable, inconsistent, difficult to please, hardened, loathsome, injurious to the cause of religion, hypocritical people on earth. End quote. Oh no, it's not end quote. And such people invite the punishment of an angry God upon them. For if you continue in your backsliding state, you may expect that by and by God will let you fall into some iniquity or some disgrace that will be a source of vexation and trial to you as long as you live. So Finney was a real nice guy. Like what Finney did was he made the point of conversion this emotional high experience. And that was built on John Wesley's heart strangely warmed experience. And then he just figured out a method to get that from larger groups of people through good marketing and psychological tricks. And then that emotional high experience has to be maintained with external evidences of devotion and internal emotions of happiness and acceptance. And then that was maintained by the fear of losing one's standing with God and ending up burning in hell forever. Now, you can see that that would cause a lot of anxiety in a soul, and it did cause a lot of anxiety in a lot of people. Now, in the early 1900s, this then converted into legalistic moralism through like church's partnership with government's prohibition, the condemnation of things like card playing, billiards, smoking, chewing tobacco, alcohol, certain novels and movies and all that. Right? And Thomas Merton said this, the devil makes many disciples by preaching against sin. He convinces them that the great evil of sin induces a crisis of guilt by which God is satisfied. And after that, he lets them spend the rest of their lives meditating on the intense sinfulness and evident reprobation of other people. I mean, he just nailed like the entire evangelical experience, that you preach against all the evils out there that are sinful, awful, horrible, whatever. And then now God is satisfied that I'm not that, but now it's still out there. And I'm going to spend the rest of my life being mad at how bad everyone else is. So that's the theological system that this question finds itself in. The question, do I need to love myself to have a relationship with God or to love God, is rooted in the soil of emotional fervor and outer behavior as evidence that I'm good with God. Right? The church used theologies of sin to breed individual shame in oneself, creating dependency upon the church, lowercase c, structure for good standing with God. And this created religious anxiety and insecurity in the common person with this default understanding of God as an angry, judgmental figure way up in the clouds somewhere who's just totally convinced I'm doing it all wrong. Now, Thomas Merton also wrote this. He said, the sin of bad theology has been precisely this, to set Christ up against humans and to regard all flesh and blood humans as not Christ. Indeed, to assume that many humans, whole classes of humans, nations, races are in fact anti-Christ. To divide humans arbitrarily according to their conformity to our own limited, discriminate mental Christ, and to decide on this basis that most humans are anti-Christ. At such a moment, we have to question not humankind, but our theology. A theology that ends in lovelessness cannot be Christian. And that was Thomas Merton out of Conjectures of a Guilty Bystander. So we created this whole generation of Christians who hate themselves and think that, like, at best, that it's a holy humility. And then they also hate out there, the world, as they're going to say it, anything that's not churchy or Christian or whatever. And God hates everything that's out there. And I'm somehow, like, topically, I believe sin has been taken care of in me, but then, like, existentially, I know it's not totally, I'm not perfect. And so you have, like, this perceived holy humility, but it's actually not. It's more self-hatred. And the church has bred self-hatred through practice and theology of these revivals. And Christ said the greatest command was to love God with all your heart, soul, and mind and strength, which is the one thing agreed upon by all the religious of his day. Like, all the religious Jews of his day, they basically prayed that prayer every day. It was called the Shema. Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, your soul, and all your strength. It's from Deuteronomy 6. They prayed it multiple times a day. Nobody argued with that. That was the greatest command. The second greatest command was up for debate. And there arose like two schools of thought. There was personal piety and morality versus the social responsibility route. Now, Jesus ended up taking the social responsibility route when he gave his opinion on the second greatest commandment, being to love your neighbor as yourself. And this wording actually states that's out of Leviticus, but the wording actually states the second commandment has equal weight as the first. So they all knew that they can't do all of the commands of God. You're going to break 3 by holding to 1. So they had to know which ones had more weight to them, which ones were the more important ones, because it was impossible to keep them all. And so that was the debate. And Jesus said, loving your neighbor as yourself has more weight than all that personal piety stuff. And not only did he say that it has more weight, but he says it has equal weight to loving God. So it's just as important to love neighbor and as yourself as it is to love God. Now, John, the Apostle John, who wrote John and 1 John's and all the 2nd and 3rd John, he would actually define this by saying we love God by loving our neighbor. And Jesus defined who is a neighbor with the parable of the Good Samaritan. The person that we all hated the most is actually my neighbor, right? So love your neighbor as yourself includes loving yourself. Now, modern day folks like to make like a tier system of love. Well, first you got to love God, and then you got to love others, and then if you got any energy left, you love yourself third. But I've actually found that love is not tiered like that. We all have a capacity of loving, and we have to put that capacity to use in a situation, and that results from an awareness of God. When we see God somewhere, we can love God there, which is why a lot of evangelical Christians can't love God in anything that's not churchy or Christian, because they don't see God there. And so they can't love people outside of the church because God isn't in them. So first, I've actually found like there's like this growth system that we go through finding awareness of God. That's what I think like the whole faith is all about, is to increase our capacity of love and increase our awareness of God. Like that's the whole point. And first it starts off in our minds as an idea. God's an idea, a theological system or whatever. We love to read, we love to learn, we love to pray, right? And next we start to love a group of people, like a church community. And we serve there to show our love towards them because we see God there. You know, we sing the songs and we hear the sermons and lots of things are going there. We can love God there. We have an awareness of God there, but it doesn't stop there. Third, like we see God in the outsider and we love them. That's what we're supposed to do. But instead, we tend to try to love outsiders by evangelizing them first. But since this comes from seeing an apparent absence of God in the outsider, we need to convert them before we can love them. And we tend to lean on Finney here and all of his measures to do this. Conform to our ways, and then we will love you. Now, we say that, this is an act of love to tell people about God. and get them into our communities and get them converted and get them changed and get them, we say, that's how we're going to love them. But really, we're not loving them. We're trying to get them to change so we can love them, so they can join the group or the club or the small group of people that allows us to love them. But we're supposed to just love the outsider. That's third, what we're supposed to do. Fourth, we can learn to see God in ourselves, in an honest assessment of our faults and our characters, and embracing them both as loved. Like, our faults are loved, our character is loved. God loves us, and it's not based on behavior. It's not based on performance. God just loves because God is love. And then, like, we can then work on conversion of the lesser things that they don't love God perfectly. Those lesser things, those faults, can then be converted to love God as we get better. But it's not a condition of receiving God's love that we convert these things. But we can love ourselves forward. That's how God loves first. So fourth is to learn to see God in ourselves, in both our faults and our character, and then we can love God in our faults and our characters. And then fifth, we learn to see God in creation, right? Like nature, physics, science, mathematics. We can see God in the natural universe and love. I love astronomy. It's like I've always loved astronomy. And some Christians freak out when I say the universe is 13.8 billion years old. They're like, oh my God, but the Bible says the earth is only 6,000 years old. I'm like, it actually doesn't say that. It doesn't once ever say that the earth is only 6,000 years old. That's a thing that we have come to believe through one man's interpretation back in like 1000 AD. And we just held on to it. So we can learn to see God in creation, in nature, in physics, and science, and mathematics, and learning, and all around us. And then the final thing, we can be unified with God and creation and humans in love, not as an act, but as a state of being. And historically, we call these folks saints or sages. So you can see that loving God, loving neighbor, and loving self is just one thing. It's just love. You have a capacity of loving. You can love others, you can love self, and you can love God. And it's all one love. It's all one movement of the soul. So do you need to love yourself in order to have a relationship with God? Yes, absolutely, you do. But not in the way that demands that you do so from a place of existential anxiety or shame or guilt or such. More like the target you're aiming for. Increase your capacity of love by increasing your awareness of God. That's the point here. Thomas Merton says, we're not at peace with others because we're not at peace with ourselves. And we're not at peace with ourselves because we're not at peace with God. And that's not because we haven't had a conversion yet, but we really don't believe that God is love. We really don't believe that God is okay with us, that God is upset with us. So yes, learn to see God in your own soul. And you're probably taught only to see the absence of God in your soul. And love is what puts God there. But that it's like a fruitless effort. God's already everywhere. We have to learn to see that God is already residing in our souls and develop a kindness towards our own story. And then that makes you more compassionate towards others because you'll stop projecting your self-hatred outward onto others. Now, here's a little thing to try. Figure out what irritates you the most about other people, and you'll probably find the thing that you don't like about yourself. Because we're projecting that outwards. Because there's a million different things that can irritate you about other people. A million different things. And only one or two of those things are highlighted in our own minds. And then we have to ask why. It's because we don't like it in ourselves, so we're certainly not going to like it out there. And if you don't have any self-knowledge, you usually think it's just the other person's problem because you can't see it in yourself. So self-knowledge is really good at dismantling self-hatred and hatred towards others. Because we fear seeing our darkness, so we hate it everywhere else we're going to see it. But then we're going to call that religious hatred like holy and justified. And a lot of angry preachers out there, a lot of them are just really mad at themselves. They just really don't like themselves. They're really just afraid that they're not measuring up. But they're going to camouflage that with aggressive alpha stances towards people and society and things. And really what they're masking is a deep fear that God's upset with them. And a lot of the world's problems could be resolved if we just stopped projecting our self-hatred outward and dealt with our lack of love towards ourselves and learn to see God where we don't expect to see God. Now, many churches are not safe spaces to do this kind of shadow work because that's off limits, thanks to Finney, who made conversion this peak experience that must be maintained by external evidence. So any confessions of shortcomings is actually an admission that you have left your good standing with God. Who's going to mention that? Who wants that? Now, when I was a youth intern, way back in the day, we're doing this summer camp. And the speaker did this message on forgiveness. And the speaker said, I thought it was a really good message on forgiveness and the need to forgive. And I had this really jerky boss that I hated desperately. He made my life miserable. And his message of forgiveness really hit home that I need to forgive this boss that treated me poorly. And so I went up to the speaker. And here I am, one of the youth leaders, and I'm like, hey, that was a really good message, and I really needed to hear that, so thank you. And he looked at me, and he's like, well, that's not good, and then just walked away. So apparently, I was not supposed to be a person who had a problem with that. I was supposed to be like totally beyond that. But here I am, like, hey, that was a really good message. That really moved me. And he's like, oh, that's not a good thing. And I was like, oh, he thinks that I'm supposed to be perfect, right? You don't love yourself after you have become worthy of love by reaching perfection. Like, that's not how it works. You love yourself as the pathway to perfection. Namely, and not perfection as in like perfect, but as in like union with God. That whole theological system. God is love. To be united with God is to be love like God is love. So learn to love yourself as you are, where you are, not as a justifier for staying that way, but as the means to move forward and become the kind of person who loves like God loves. So that is my really long-winded 40-minute answer to the first question. Do I need to love myself to have a relationship with God? Yes. Now, Jason wrote in and asked a question, and it kind of goes in with the last one. He asked, how does one grow in their faith? Man, that's a loaded question. We need to disconnect the idea of growing in our faith as a spiritual thing we do at the expense of our humanity. Now, we need to also disconnect the idea of growing in our faith from mere behavioral conformity tied to theological adherence. Right? If I have all the right doctrines in my head and I keep my nose clean, then I should be good. I should be growing in my faith, right? Now, growing in faith is actually not growing in your ability to behaviorally conform. Growing in your faith is not your ability to know more theological facts about God. Like, we don't disconnect growing in our faith from our humanity. Growing in faith is actually growing in trust of the character and nature of God. But this is not displayed in some kind of passive, like, well, God's got this stance towards life, right? Like, we trust that God is love, and therefore we reject the grasping of power to accomplish God's means in the world. Like, power is not the way. Grasping for power and getting power and then wielding power over others to get conformity out of them is not how we accomplish God's means in the world. If we're growing in our faith and we trust that God is love, then we will not use power to manipulate people like Finney did. Right? The evangelical political agenda that's tied up with the Republican Party and the conservative right are trying to gain power to shape society. Like, that's all misguided. That's all misguided form of trying to gain power, and then use power to shape the society to be what you want it to be, so that we can become some kind of Christian nation, right? And this has led evangelicals to embracing like many political candidates that an earlier generation would have flagged as the Antichrist come to deceive the world. Like if you grew up in that form of Christianity, a lot of the modern day Republican candidates that people are flocking to are just like, man, my teenage self would have been like, are we really backing up behind this person, right? And that has led to a loss of trust from the greater society as evangelicals impose their cultural mandates in an attempt to become a Christian nation, which is an oxymoron because Christ opposed the empire with love. See Brian Zand's book called Farewell to Mars on that one. We have to get back to this understanding that we trust that God is love and that this love must be enacted in justice for those on the fringes and margins. And our love should benefit the least of these. That's really what we should be all about. Now, as mentioned before, awareness of God and capacity of loving is how I see the goal of spiritual life. And there's kind of like this threefold spiritual growth process that I've noticed. And I've separated out the vocabulary because usually when we mention one of these things, it's supposed to be all one thing, but it's not anymore. Like the term discipleship. Discipleship was an all-encompassing term used at one time for somebody who has apprenticed themselves to the way of Jesus. They want to live like Christ lived. That was what it meant to be a disciple, to be an apprentice. Like a plumber would be shadowing another plumber to learn and apprentice on how to be a plumber, right? A disciple would shadow their rabbi and learn to become the kind of person the rabbi was. Now, discipleship has since become known as just growing in knowledge and skills for a religious end. Like you're probably thinking of book studies and Bible studies and Sunday schools. And they get this theology in your head. And there's nothing wrong with theology. I really liked my studies of theology. It's been very helpful for me. But discipleship has come to be known as increasing your knowledge of God through theological understanding. And then also skills that are used for a religious end, like preaching or music or administration or leadership. Like churches are really good. They love to train this stuff. They call it discipleship. We have a whole discipleship pathway for, people who come to our church. And they basically teach you, this is what we believe, and these are the things the church needs done. And that's your discipleship. That's very incomplete. That's good to learn things, to get better at skills and knowledge. It's not a bad thing. It's just, if that's all you're getting, you're not going to learn, the character and nature of Christ. So that's what discipleship is. It's growing in knowledge and skills for a religious end. Now, there's a second way to grow, and that is in the new terminology coming out recent days called spiritual formation. And that is the shaping of your character and virtues, right? Like self-control, moderation, love, diligence, patience, kindness, humility. Like churches demand some of these things without giving the paradigm for growing in them. They're like, you better have self-control. How do I do that? I don't know, just pray. Learn more theology, I guess. They don't teach you how to have self-control. They don't teach you how to practice moderation. They don't teach you what it is to love or be diligent or pay. They don't teach you how to grow in those things. They just say that you ought to have them because you're a Christian now, so you better have them. But they don't actually teach you how to get them. How does one grow in virtue and character? So the spiritual formation movement came about through Renoir, Richard Foster, Dallas Willard, and that whole crowd. And they say that we do spiritual practices that cultivates the soil of our life so that seeds have the right environment to grow. So Richard Foster, he wrote about that. He calls it the law of indirection, where you indirectly grow in virtues because to directly gain the virtue itself would be to bypass grace. So I'm going to be humble. So I'm going to pursue humility, and then I'm going to get it. And now I'm humble. And now I'm telling everyone how humble I am. Oh, wait, now I'm not humble anymore. So you don't become humble by pursuing humility and then getting it through your own efforts, because there's nothing humble about that. You put yourself intentionally before God in a spiritual practice where you are now out of your own control and manipulation. You relinquish your desire to manipulate your own life towards some kind of goal or end or anything. And now humility is fostered in you through the practice of, generosity, or, loving the least of these. All of a sudden, when you do a spiritual practice, you put yourself in the presence of God intentionally so that you can become changed. And it's a spiritual practice. And if you want to know more, Celebration of Discipline is one of the best books that's written on that. Dallas Willard has some good books on that as well. And that's when we intentionally do something that places our life before God, and we get out of our own control, and then God does something within us with God's grace, and we learn a virtue. We grow in virtue. You don't do that by just cramming theology in your head. So that's formation. And I remember I said there's three. There's discipleship, there's growing in skills and knowledge for a religious end. There's formation, which is the shaping of character and virtue. But then there's this third one, which is developing this inner awareness of God's permeating presence. And this is called contemplation. Now, normally we'd be like, well, that's for the weirdos and the monks and the recluses and all those kinds of people. But really it's not. Contemplation is just traversing the inner landscape of your life to find God and then come back with the gift of yourself for the world. Now, that sounds really dramatic, but it's not dramatic. It's just a non-anxious presence that you bring to the world. It's like it's a grounded strength that you know who you are, you're grounded in it, you know what you're good at, you know what you're not good at, and you're not trying to do any kind of ego displays of anything. It's a non-anxious presence is not to be confused with like general anxiety or situational anxiety or even spiritual anxiety. It's not to have no anxiety. It's to not necessarily be so anxious about who you think you are versus who you think you ought to be. You're not fussing around in other people's lives trying to get a certain end out of them. You just are, and you meet them as they are. You meet you as you are. You provide hospitable space for them to be in God's presence, in your presence, and that's really what humility is. And that can only happen with somebody who has kind of done the inner work of their inner life, and they know really the landscape of their whole soul. And that whole thing is the contemplative experience. There's contemplatives who are contemplative by nature, and then there's contemplative practices you can do that just kind of foster this. Not everyone's going to have a contemplative disposition, but everyone can practice contemplative practices that get you aware of your inner landscape. So yeah, there's some weirdos and monks and recluses that are contemplatives by nature, but it's not just that. It's traversing the inner landscape of your own soul. So discipleship, formation, and contemplation, if you really want to grow in your faith, you got to be aware of those three, and you have to act accordingly, and make sure that you're doing things that increase your capacity of love and awareness of God in the world. I got another group of questions from Jacki, and this one is a little bit more difficult to answer because this is one I'm still wrestling with myself. But I'm going to throw the question out there. I'll talk about it a little bit, and I might come back around to it at one point. But what is the point of praying on behalf of someone? Does a person's praying for someone bring them to the attention of God, and then God gives them the grace and protection or the healing that they need? Like, my thought, and this is Jacki's question still, my thought is that God is already taking care of that person and has them on the radar. It just doesn't seem like we need to remind God to have grace or mercy on an individual. So what's the point of praying for someone? And I really don't know how that works. I know that sometimes miracles happen and God's intervention happens, and sometimes it doesn't. Many times it doesn't. So what was the point of doing it? I'm not quite sure what. Some people seem to be gifted in this thing called intercessory prayer. Some people have I don't know what it is, like they just can do that. They can pray and then God moves, and then there's a healing there where they have like a better track record than just your average person that's just like, oh, I'll be prayed for you. I don't know what makes a difference, but I've taken some classes on like the healing traditions in Christianity, and there's lots of evidence that praying for someone can change the outcome of something. And there's a boatload of evidence that praying for someone doesn't change an ounce of what happened. So I'm really not sure. I know that praying for someone can be an act of love for them. So what I've been doing, instead of like trying to think of the best, when you're taught to pray for someone, you're usually like, okay, I gotta like paint a verbal picture of where I hope they end up and then tell God to do that. But then to amend that picture with, but if it's your will to do something else, you can go ahead and do that because I'm limited in my understanding. Like, so we spend a lot of energy trying to figure out I just stopped doing that. I don't try to tell God, like, here's what I think you ought to do. I just create like a mental space for the person, and I just bring them into the presence of God in my mind. So if someone has specifically asked me to pray for them, like that would be the thing that I would feel comfortable doing, because I don't know what is the best thing to pray for. Like, I don't know how to do that. I don't know what words to use. I don't know. I can't conjure anything up. I'm not some people are gifted at praying for others and getting things changed. I've seen people that have those specific giftings. I'm not one of them. So what I do is I just kind of create mental space for the person and just kind of hold them in my heart. And I'll tell them that I'm holding space for you today. Like I'm really thinking about you today. And that gets people to feel like, oh wow, they thought of me. That's something. That's something worthy. Are we like making God change God's mind? I have no idea how prayer works on a metaphysical level. That's beyond my pay grade. I don't know if me holding space for someone makes their day better. I don't know, but it helps me do something it helps me grow in love for that person, because I'm now doing something in my mind. I'm thinking about them when I normally wouldn't be thinking about them, and I got to think somewhere in the quantum physical universe somewhere that's got to make some kind of a change somewhere. I don't know. I don't know how that one works. So that's my half-assed answer to Jacki's question. Now, Jeremie asked me a question very similar, so I just wanted to highlight that one. Do you think the current interpretation of prayer in modern Christianity is lost in translation? Meaning, instead of asking an omnipotent spirit in the sky for favors, prayer is intended to be a time of meditation and introspection, maybe similar to meditative practices in other religious traditions. And I would say, yeah, a lot of prayer is meant for meditation and introspection, but there's also collective prayers that have been used for a long time, where a church will get together and collectively, liturgical churches around the world, they're all praying Psalm whatever on this day because it's in the liturgy. Like there's collective prayers that people pray all at the same time on Sunday all over the world because they're in the liturgical calendar. Now, is there some kind of meditative and introspective thing? Yes, but it's not merely individual. Meditation and introspection, I am not one to down on that because that's my jam. But there's also a communal aspect to saying prayers out loud together. That's not necessarily, the just prayers that I learned in my evangelical. God, I just want you to just do that thing for that person. Just like show your grace. And like, okay, maybe that works. Maybe that's a start, but I'm done with those. At our church here, we pray all shall be well and all shall be well and all manner of things shall be well. We've been praying that prayer for a long time. We say it out loud together. And someone on their Facebook page from our church was facing something difficult, something very hard, and they posted that prayer, that they were praying that prayer this day. And I thought that was really, really good. I thought that was just really cool. I think that prayer, the just prayers, the God, just do this and just do that, there's probably lost in translation. We're trying to, be awesome and sound awesome. And it's more like ego displays where we're making religious faces at ourselves in the mirror, and then we think our experience of ourselves is an experience of God. And really, I think there's a lot more meditative, introspective, and communal aspect to prayer. Again, metaphysically, I don't know what that does. That's out of my pay grade. But I do them, and they help. And that's enough for me for right now. I don't necessarily believe that there's a big sky daddy in the clouds that's just waiting for me to say the right words, and then the sky daddy waves his magic wand and makes everything perfect again. I used to think that's how it worked, and then I couldn't figure out the right combination of words to access the sky daddy favor, and it didn't work. So now I don't know. Jason wrote a question: is there a difference between Christian meditation and meditation in other religions? And the answer is both a yes and a no. Christian meditation, yes, it's done within the framework of Christianity. I would say Thomas Keating's centering prayer is a form of Christian meditation. So there's Christian ways to meditate with Christianity as a bracket, a structure. But it's doing the same thing in your brain as other meditative practices from other religions. So this was just one I can like shoot off the list real easy. Yes, there's a difference. It's done within the Christian tradition and framework, but it's doing the same thing in your brain. And I've studied brainwaves in meditation, and they studied Pentecostals speaking in tongues. They've studied Zen Buddhists and their deep meditation. They've studied faith healers. They've studied shamans. They've studied, monks, Christian monks, Taoist monks. And they did a whole big brain study on all of them doing their meditative practices, and they were all identical on the MRI brain scans were producing the same thing in their brains across the traditions. So I don't tell people that I practice Christian meditation. I just meditate. And you don't even have to have any religious tradition attached to meditation to do it. There's atheists and agnostics that meditate just upon silence and solitude, and they're practicing meditation without any religion at all. And again, it's doing the same thing inside of their brains. You're producing the same brain waves. So yes and no, kind of a difference, kind of not. And I want to wrap this Ask Me Anything episode up with Tim's question: if you could give spiritual advice to your 20-year-old self, what would the most important thing you'd say? What would be the most important thing you'd say to my 20-year-old self? And I actually don't have any notes on this, and I'm just going to go off the cuff. I just kicked a box with my foot. I'm just going to go off the cuff. What is the thing I would say to my 20-year-old self? I would say chill out. Like, just relax. I was pretty fundamentalist as a 20-year-old. I bought into hook, line, and sinker, the whole Christian evangelical structure as ultimate reality. The small evangelical framework described the metaphysical reality of the entire universe, and anyone who was not inside of my understanding of the metaphysical understanding of the universe was in the wrong. I would tell my 20-year-old self, calm your ass down. Like, you are not absolutely 100% in the know, in the right, in the perfect. There is wisdom to be gained from so many different people and places and cultures, and yours is not the best. It's actually kind of piss poor. If you would just calm down, get a non-anxious presence about you, and just learn from different people who are not like you, who don't think like you, don't act like you, don't believe like you, have different voting things than you, different religion than you, different culture than you, different ethnicity than you. Sit back and learn from the diversity of humanity, because God is not a white man. God is not a white man's religion. Christianity is not a white man's religion. This is a human thing, and there are many different ways to be human, not just what you have believed and held to and thought was ultimate reality. That's actually a form of white supremacy, because who decided what that was? A bunch of white guys in Europe a long time ago. You can just calm down. Calm down. There's a lot of different ways to be human, and the things that make us more human are the things that make us more like God, because our faith tells us that Christ became human, and that Christ lived a fully human life, and that God is somehow God is this human person named Christ, and that he died and he resurrected and he rose from the dead, and he didn't stop being human when he rose from the dead. He's like, okay, I'm done with being human. I'm going to be God again. Like, the doctrine of the incarnation does not say that. The doctrine of the incarnation says that Christ is human, and Christ came as a human, that he lived as a human, he died as a human, he resurrected as a human, he ascended back to God as a human. So if you think about that, there is a human man sitting at the right hand of God as a part of the Trinity. There's a human in there. And so to be human is to be like God. So there's so many different ways to learn what it's like to be human. And it's not just in my small little world. So that's the advice I would give my 20-year-old self. Calm down. Don't make it as serious as this. There's many different ways to be human, and there's lots of different things, lots of different paths that you can learn from, not just your own. Thank you for listening to me rant on for all these questions, a lot of questions. Next time we do an Ask Me Anything, I'm going to do some theological questions, like how can Adam and Eve be blamed for eating the fruit before they had knowledge of good and evil? Well, you have to be tempted to desire something you don't know. Okay. We're going to take on the gender of God. If humans are created in God's image, why is God a man all the time, right? Like, that's one. We're going to talk about karma. We're going to talk about the nature of the Bible. We're going to talk about Bible and science and evolution, and we're going to talk about heaven and hell and dinosaurs and salvation, and do our pets go to heaven, and predestination, and it's going to be chocked full of stuff. And we're going to be like spitting out some fun answers, like, is hell real and does it matter? Oh, that's a good question. We're going to ask that. So that'll be next time we do the Ask Me Anything, but I got a couple of interviews that we're going to dive into first. The rest of this month, we got some interesting perspectives that we're going to share with you, some more conversation styles. So yeah, thanks for listening, and we will be back next week with episode number 14, lucky 14, 7, and that'll be awesome. Thanks for listening. Thanks for sending in these questions, and thanks for trusting me to not beat you over the head with answers. So peace out.